Dale Baskin. I'm the Director of Admissions, and I am excited to be here at UWLA. I'm very happy that you could join us today for our UWLA guest speaker, the Honorable John Heilman. A little bit about how this will go this evening. Mr. Heilman is a law professor. He's teaching a class at another law school. Yes, there are others at 6 p.m. So we will need to wrap this up by 5:50 p.m. What will happen is after my introduction, Mr. Heilman will speak, share his remarks and slides, and then we'll have a few minutes left for your questions. We're excited that you would join us for UWLA as we celebrate Pride Month 2023, and again featuring Honorable John Heilman. He's our city council member and former mayor, city of West Hollywood, that is, and law school professor. We will be looking at advancing LGBTQ rights through local government. UWLA is proud and honored to have the Honorable John Heilman as our guest speaker for this Pride Month. Mr. Heilman was active in the incorporation of the city of West Hollywood, in fact. He was elected to the city's first city council in November 1984. He was chosen as the city's second mayor in 1985. He also served as the mayor 6 more times over the following 2 decades. Re-elected to the city council in November 2022, he is one of the longest serving openly gay elected officials in the United States. One of Mr. Heilman's top platforms has been affordable and fair housing, and he was instrumental in the establishment of the West Hollywood Community Housing Corporation, which is a city-funded organization that develops affordable housing in West Hollywood and the surrounding region. He also helped develop the city's landmark rent stabilization ordinance. Thank you so much. He helped create the city's inclusionary housing policy, which requires developers of new residential buildings to include housing for low-income and moderate-income residents. Mr. Heilman drafted the city's landmark ordinance prohibiting discrimination on the basis of HIV and AIDS, later receiving the U.S. Conference of Mayors Award for his leadership on the issue of AIDS. Mr. Heilman was also instrumental in having West Hollywood, watch this, declared a pro-choice city. And he also initiated the city's law protecting individuals from discrimination based on gender identity. Our speaker is a truly a scholar, having obtained his bachelor's degree from Northwestern in journalism. He went on to get his law degree from the University of Southern California, a master's degree in public administration, and a second master's degree in real estate development, where he is focused on affordable housing development. Professor Heilman teaches law at Southwestern Law School, and he is an adjunct professor at USC Law School, among other schools. We do hope one day he'll teach a course here or two at UWLA, but we're excited to have Honorable John Heilman, and please join me in thanking and welcoming the Honorable Professor John Heilman. We turn it over to you.
Verdell, thank you so much for that very generous introduction. And you already covered half of my presentation, so I won't have to do much today. I thought it would be interesting because this is Pride Month and we're focusing on the advancement of LGBTQ plus rights, I thought it would be interesting to talk a little bit about how important action at the local level is and how influential that is. But I also want to talk a little bit about what's happening at state level, what's happening internationally as well, and how all of those activities are interrelated and interconnected. As Verdell mentioned, West Hollywood became a city in 1984. And this is one of the community meetings right when we had our first city, had our city established. It was one of the first meetings. And on the right from the back, that's me. much younger, less gray, and much thinner. And part of what was the impetus for founding West Hollywood, in part, was LGBT rights, but also the advancement of affordable housing, rent control. 85% of our residents at the time were renters, many of them seniors. So this was a meeting of a rent control organization, the Coalition for Economic Survival, that was very instrumental in the push for cityhood. And then, sorry, my PowerPoint. This, again, just shows you we became a city in 1984, and we had, most cities, when they're formed, they get some attention. They don't get global attention, which is what West Hollywood did. And that's because we were the first city in the world with an openly LGBT majority on the city council. And we got interviewed by reporters from France and Japan, and everyone wanted to know how were gay people going to get the trash collected? How were we going to pave the roads? Of course, the same way every other city does, but there was this incredible interest in the birth of this very, very small city. And this is the first city council. This is me with the bow tie. In the middle was our mayor, and next to her was Steve Schulte, who had been the head of the Lesbian and Gay, or the Gay and Lesbian Center at that time. So the three in the middle, we made up the LGBT majority, although we didn't always get along or agree on everything, but that's how politics works. One of the first things we did as a city was adopt an ordinance prohibiting discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. This was before the state of California had any kind of laws on the books to prohibit discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. So that was one of the first things that we did as a city to respond to the needs and the concerns of our residents. Like many small cities in California, we contract for services. We had been served by the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. And when we became a city, we wanted to continue that contract. That was pretty much the consensus of the council and the community. But we wanted to make sure that the language of the contract prohibited discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. So we insisted upon that. And eventually the sheriffs agreed to that language, even though they were already prohibited from discriminating on the basis of sexual orientation. We wanted it explicit in the language of the contract. And eventually that was the contract that they used for all of the other cities that they worked with. So that non-discrimination language got put into the contract that they signed with every city in LA County. I know the focus is on LGBTQ plus rights. So why do I have a slide about social services? Well, social services is an important aspect of what local government provides, at least some do. And remember 1984, for those of you who were around then, this is really when the AIDS epidemic began to explode. So we had a lot of residents. In fact, at one point, we had 10% of our residents who were HIV positive or who had AIDS. So making sure that there were services, meals, counseling, insurance assistance, all of the kind of services that people would need, that was part of our commitment to our community. But we also had a lot of seniors who needed services, and then services for the LGBT community generally through the Gay and Lesbian Center, through other organizations that were serving our community. So one of the things that I'm proud about in terms of our city is that we provided more funding per capita for social services than any other city in the country at the time when we began our social services programs. And that commitment has continued through different changes in the city council and different changes in administration. We were, as Verdal said earlier, we were the first city, along with the city of Los Angeles, we did it jointly, to adopt an ordinance prohibiting discrimination on the basis of HIV or AIDS. And not only did we pass that law, but we also implemented it. We had a nail salon that refused to provide service to a man who had AIDS. And so we went to court to challenge them and enforce our ordinance, and ultimately we were successful. This commitment to non-discrimination is part of the DNA of our city, as you'll see a number of the other ordinances we eventually adopted. One of the other things we did in the very early days of cityhood, I believe it was 1985 or 86, we adopted a domestic partnership registration program, which seems very quaint and a little bit passé now that we have marriage equality. But at the time, it was the only opportunity for people in same-sex relationships to have any kind of government recognition. And our ordinance allowed people to register wherever they were from. So our ordinance allowed couples to register if they were foreign. And we had a couple from France who had been together for 35 years, and they registered under our ordinance. And they did so because it was just that act of the government giving recognition to their relationship was so important to them. They didn't get any tangible benefits from the ordinance, but it was very meaningful to them that somebody would recognize their relationship. Now, the photos you have here, this is the couple that was the 10,000th. I don't know if I'm saying that right. This was couple 10,000. That's a little bit easier with my Invisalign in. This is couple 10,000 registering under our domestic partnership ordinance, and then our city clerk and city staff were there to celebrate with them. We were also we were the first city to adopt a policy that we would not do business with companies that were involved in the apartheid regime in South Africa. At the time, South Africa had apartheid, and I think even though our community is not, it's largely white, this was an issue that was of importance to us because we recognize that human rights are really indivisible, and you can't be advocating for human rights for LGBT members of the community without advocating for the rights of everyone. So this was a very important policy for us. And we were challenged, but we held firm. And so we did not do business with a number of banks and a number of other institutions because of their ties to the South African apartheid regime. Verdal mentioned that we established a nonprofit community housing corporation. The West Hollywood Community Housing Corporation was established 2 years after we became a city. And it was something that other communities had done. We certainly weren't the first, but it was an idea that we brought forward because we recognized that even though we had a strong rent control ordinance, that wasn't going to address the needs of everyone in the community. And particularly people living with HIV and AIDS at that time who were losing their jobs or were not healthy enough to work and support themselves, they found themselves in the community unable to afford their rent. So the Housing Corporation built one of the first buildings designed for people living with HIV and AIDS. These are a couple of the projects. The one on the left is on La Brea. The one on the right is an award-winning building on Santa Monica. We also stressed the importance of designing these buildings so that they were interesting and appealing, where people would want to live and want to locate. These are a couple of other buildings. This one on the left is geared and has a number of residents with severe disabilities. This one has more of a courtyard feel to it. And the Housing Corporation not only builds in West Hollywood, but they've been building a lot of buildings in Los Angeles. They've built in Burbank, Glendale, and they have a project in Palm Springs. So they've really grown, and they're providing this kind of development elsewhere. And they also recognize that you can't just build affordable housing. You've got to integrate services, particularly for people living with disabilities or living with HIV. Verdell also mentioned the inclusionary housing ordinance. So we use the power of our zoning ordinance to say, all right, if you're building housing in West Hollywood, you've got to set aside 20% of the units for low and moderate income residents. Now, those units are in addition to what the base zoning would allow. So if the base zoning would allow 40 units, the developer can build 40 market rate units, and then they can build the additional 20%, 8 more units, but those 8 units have to be reserved for low and moderate income residents. We also recognized that LGBT rights are indivisible, not just from human rights generally, but for the struggle. They're indivisible from the struggle for equality for women and girls. So we have had a number of initiatives in terms of women's equality, and one of those initiatives was to declare ourselves a pro-choice city. We also provide funding for Planned Parenthood for services for our residents, the full range of services, including reproductive health, STI, STD, treatment, and detection. We established a LGBT, Lesbian and Gay Advisory Board. Initially, it was just lesbian and gay. Then it expanded to the Lesbian and Gay and Bisexual and Transgender Advisory Board. And now it's LGBTQ+, and it's a commission rather than an advisory board. This gives an opportunity for residents in the community to be engaged and also to promote programming for the community. One of the programs is a Rainbow Key Award that we give to a variety of individuals and organizations that serve the community, but oftentimes don't get recognition. We also established a Women's Advisory Board that puts on programs throughout the year. One of the initiatives was the Women's Leadership Conference, giving opportunities for women to come together and talk about leadership, hear from other women leaders, and to promote leadership among women in our community. We established a Transgender Advisory Board. There's me on the right with strange hair. But our Transgender Advisory Board has been really a wonderful addition to our community. Put on a day of remembrance to recognize and commemorate all of the victims of violence from the transgender community, particularly transgender women of color. But there's other programs that are initiated throughout the year. And they also have the ability to communicate with other service providers and really be a resource for others in the community who want to make sure that they're addressing transgender issues and that they're addressing them in an appropriate way. We adopted an ordinance prohibiting discrimination on the basis of gender identity. Our initial non-discrimination ordinance back in '84 and '85, we were just talking about sexual orientation, but as greater understanding and development occurred, we recognized that no, we also need to have specific prohibitions on discrimination against people who are transgender based on gender identity. So that's something that we adopted later on. Now, I know the focus today, because it's Pride Month, is on LGBTQ rights. So why do I have a photo of the library here? Well, it was one of my projects, so I'm very proud of it. But it is also something where we, in our West Hollywood library, we incorporated LGBT collection. So we have a whole area that is designated for our LGBTQ collection, various literature, and it's also sort of an area in the library that's viewed as a safe space for people to go and explore. But if you haven't been to the West Hollywood Library, I urge you to visit. It's a wonderful facility. And even though we had domestic partners, obviously the push was for marriage equality. And when California finally, when marriage equality was finally legal in California, we celebrated like everyone else. But part of our celebration was to perform weddings for people. Now, if you know anything about marriage law, marriages are usually conducted by county officials and they oversee the process of marrying. But because there was such a demand in our community and such a desire to be in West Hollywood and get married, we, the county deputized all of the city council members and a number of the city staff, and we performed over 350 weddings in the first couple of days after marriage equality was legal. And you can see the joy on this couple's face. And also we created these nice little cabanas for people and their guests to be in as they got married. Then same-sex marriage eventually became legal throughout the country. Because this is the law school, I figure I could throw in some cases. If you haven't read United States versus Windsor in 2013, that's the case where the Supreme Court struck down the Federal Defense of Marriage Act. And this is Edie Windsor, who was challenging that act. She married her wife in Canada. They lived in New York. New York recognized their marriage as valid because it was valid in a foreign country. When her spouse died, she faced an enormous tax liability that she would not have faced if her spouse had been male. Because the federal government had this Defense of Marriage Act and the federal government didn't recognize same-sex marriage, she was treated differently than an opposite-sex married couple would have been treated. And eventually it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court struck down the Defense of Marriage Act. A couple of years later, the Supreme Court determined that same-sex marriage had to be legal throughout the country. They determined that limiting marriage to opposite-sex couples violated both concepts of due process and equal protection. Oberfell, this is Jim Oberfell, who was the lead plaintiff. There was a consolidation of several cases challenging marriage laws, or discriminatory marriage laws. And if you don't know the backstory here, or if you haven't read the case, it's really quite moving. All of the couples and their qualities and their experiences are moving. But this one in particular, his husband had suffered from a terminal illness and did not have long to live when they got married. Ohio didn't allow for same-sex marriage, so they flew to, I believe it was Maryland, to get married. And the husband here was so ill, he could not even get off the plane. So they got married on the tarmac in the airport in Maryland, and then flew back to Ohio, and eventually he died shortly thereafter. But the dispute with Obergefell was that Ohio wouldn't allow him to be listed as a spouse on the death certificate. And that has, it has financial implications in terms of insurance and the like, but just the indignity of not being listed as your spouse on your spouse's death certificate. So that's when the Supreme Court, again, declared marriage laws that prohibited same-sex marriage, that was unconstitutional, and that same-sex couples have to be given the right to marry. But at the local level, we kept pushing boundaries. Most of you have probably had the experience of going to a restaurant, and there are two restrooms, one marked male, one marked female. Both of those restrooms are single use, right? They have a single toilet. And so why do they have to be labeled male and female? Why can't anyone use those restrooms? So we adopted a law that said if there are single use restrooms, they have to be gender neutral. Now, for most of us, that isn't an important issue, but for transgender people, it is a big issue to be able to go to a restroom and not have to, get looks because you're going into the restroom that is consistent with your gender identity. And I'm not transgender, but I'm on a board where one of our staff people is transgender, and she's quite tall and a little bit, if you don't know her, you might be intimidated by her, but she's as sweet as can be. And we were out at a restaurant in an environment that she didn't know well, and she needed to use the restroom, but was feeling uncomfortable. And she said, if I go into the women's restroom, I'm afraid that people are going to get upset. And if I go into the male restroom, I'm not presenting as male, so I'm worried about that. So eventually, I was able to make sure no one was in the male restroom, and she was able to use that restroom. I just stood outside and made sure no one entered. But it is a big issue, and it's especially a big issue for transgender youth in schools where they don't have access to a restroom. And there's just lots of studies showing the health impacts, because they'll dehydrate, they'll avoid drinking, they'll avoid going to the restroom, or they'll skip school because of issues involving restrooms. Or, in some instances, they will use the restroom that is consistent with their gender identity and then face violence or threats because of it. So being able to establish restrooms where people don't need to worry about what gender is the restroom is a good thing. I saw the library early, and now you're looking at another thing that doesn't appear to be LGBT centric, and that is the establishment of our new recreation center. If you get a chance, and if you're ever at West Hollywood Park, we built a new recreation center with roof deck pools and gymnasium and community meeting rooms. But we also, as part of that project, wanted to recognize the history of the city and recognize and commemorate all of those people that we lost during the AIDS epidemic. So one component of the project is an AIDS monument, which is delayed. It's city projects are like that. We're still behind on it, but ultimately when it's completed, it's going to be, I think, a very important recognition of a lot of the early days of the city of West Hollywood. As part of our efforts with respect to HIV, we also adopt a Getting to Zero campaign, trying to make sure that people who are infected are in treatment, and getting on treatment reduces the ability to transmit the virus. and making sure that people who are not infected or who even if they are infected, that they're using PrEP to prevent them from getting infected. So this is, again, part of our initiatives, always trying to move forward, even though at the federal level, we may not be making progress on certain issues. Now, a lot of times people ask me, well, doing all these progressive rent control things and, LGBT rights and pro-choice, doesn't that adversely impact the community? I would say economically, it has not adversely impacted the community. In fact, we have found businesses that want to locate in West Hollywood because they share those same values. Our budget when we first became a city was estimated to be about 15 million in revenue. And we're now at a place where our annual revenues are closer to 130, 120. Obviously it had impacts from COVID, but we have a very substantial revenue because of, in part, we've supported our business community, our hotels, our nightclubs, our movie studio that we have, and our creative businesses. They've been very much an important part of our economic development. Now, I could do a whole thing on economic development, but I know we don't have time. But shifting back to the national level, in 2020, just 2 years ago, another very important case decided, Bostock versus Clayton County. And this was the case where the Supreme Court said that the Title VII, the prohibition on sex discrimination, it's part of the civil rights laws. The prohibition on sex discrimination in Title VII also includes discrimination based on gender identity and based on sexual orientation. The Supreme Court said you cannot discriminate against people on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation without also discriminating against them on the basis of sex. If you're treating a gay man differently than you're treating a straight man, the reason you're doing it is because of the sex of their partner. And that's a form of sex discrimination. And you're also likely discriminating against them because of perceptions about how males or females are supposed to appear. Now, these were the three plaintiffs here. The two men had been fired for being gay. One had worked for the county and joined a gay softball league, and that was discovered by the employer, the county, and he was fired. The other was working in a flight-related business, and he too was fired when it was discovered that he was gay. The woman in the middle was transgender. She transitioned while working at a mortuary and was fired as a result of that for being transgender. And all three of them were eventually victorious. Unfortunately, two of them died in the interim while the case was pending. So, a lot of what I was talking about is things that we did at the local level and the importance of that. And the reason I say the importance of that is I think the domestic partnership and that spread to different places in the country, that really created a basis and a groundwork for marriage equality. What's the big deal when people are able to register and get certain rights as we were in California? Why not just let them get married? So it took away some of the argument. Our non-discrimination laws that on the basis of AIDS, eventually that became part of the Americans with Disability Act. So I think what happens at the local level matters and it influences. I did want to touch a little bit on some of the current things and then talk a little bit about some global issues as well. And then hopefully we'll have some time for questions. you might have seen, I'm sure you did, that Tennessee passed a law banning certain drag performances. And obviously that was one of over 200 laws targeting the LGBT community. But just earlier this month, a judge declared that law unconstitutional. The judge concluded that it was substantially overbroad, that the language was vague, that it impinged on the First Amendment rights of drag performers. And I'm confident that almost all of these laws are going to be struck down. Likewise, Florida banned gender-affirming care for transgender minors. And just earlier this month, a few weeks ago, a federal judge enjoined that law, concluding that, and actually the opinion is quite good, because the judge basically said that this was a political stunt, that the legislature had no legitimate governmental interest for enacting this, and it was enacted for purely policy reasons and political, or not policy, but political reasons. And one of the interesting things is some of the care that is being banned, it is provided to non-transgender individuals. So some of the treatments and care that transgender youth receive, that same kind of treatment is provided to youth who aren't transgender, but who may have a hormonal imbalance or hormonal irregularity. So it's ridiculous that this treatment is considered so dangerous that it can't be given to a transgender youth, but it's being given to cisgender youth. So why do I'm very optimistic that most of those laws are going to be struck down, but it is an attack on our community, and we do need to stand up against it. And it's also an attack, very cynically, on the most vulnerable people in our community. Transgender youth, they're not going after LGBT or gay CEOs of big companies. They're going after the people who are most marginalized, who are most vulnerable. And that's, essentially what they're doing here. And it's very important that all of us recognize that that kind of attack is an attack on everyone in the community, and we need to respond. But even though I'm optimistic that those laws are going to be struck down, I'm very worried about what that says in terms of the global struggle for LGBT rights. I think it emboldens and empowers other countries that don't care about LGBT rights to do these sort of things. And as a country, we've lost some of our, to the extent that we have any moral grounds to object to what other countries are doing, we lose some of that when, these kind of laws are sweeping parts of the country. Uganda passed the most horrific bill targeting the gay community. And it wasn't something initiated in Uganda. It was actually initiated by organizations in the United States, far-right religious organizations, really were behind a lot of this. But I have to say, I'm so proud of the activists. I'm on the board of an organization called Outright International, and we've been working with some of the activists in Uganda who are fighting back. And these people are fearless, they are powerful. They, unfortunately, some of them have had to leave the country, but they are prepared to challenge this law, and they are challenging it not just in the courts, but they're prepared to challenge it in the streets. And that's really motivating to see how strong they are in response. Ukraine, a lot of the LGBTQ community in Ukraine, when Russia invaded, we all know Russia and Putin have targeted the LGBT community and have passed really horrific laws. So people in Ukraine felt that they were going to be targeted. And likely they would be had Russia succeeded in all of its goals in Ukraine. But many of them joined the military if they were able to do that. Some of them were displaced internally. Some of them had to leave the country. The organization I mentioned, Outright, we immediately began raising money, and we've now distributed $3 million to different organizations, both within Ukraine and in the surrounding countries, to provide assistance to LGBTQ plus refugees. And I bring that up because it's not just Ukrainians, it's anytime there's a crisis, whether it's a earthquake or a war or some other crisis and people are displaced, the LGBT community is part of that. And unfortunately, all of our wonderful humanitarian organizations, and they are wonderful, they don't necessarily have the skills and ability and training to deal with a transgender individual in a refugee camp, or how to help members of the LGBT community who are victimized at home, and they're certainly going to be even more vulnerable in a refugee camp. And then one other thing that's going on globally is Outright has been documenting conversion therapy practices and trying to get those banned throughout the world and calling attention to it. And when you read the report from Outright, one of the startling things for me was this is not something that's being forced upon members of the community. Oftentimes, the members of the community, because the discrimination and hatred and homophobia and transphobia is so great in their country, they're willingly going into this conversion therapy, even though we know that it doesn't work. But that's a challenge on the global level. I don't want to end with that kind of negativity. I do want to mention that there's lots of really positive things happening around the globe. Outright just had its annual gala, and we celebrated the work of Caribbean activists who've been really great in getting some of the old sodomy laws, colonial sodomy laws, struck down. They've also been really instrumental in getting LGBTQ people included in protections against gender violence. We've seen incredible progress in parts of Africa, also in parts of Asia where we've been working. So there is a lot of progress happening around the globe. But when that progress occurs, it's always going to face a pushback. And I think that's where we are in the US. So as a law professor, you know, I always have to wrap things up and tie things together. So my major themes here: what happens at the local level matters. It certainly matters for LGBTQ plus rights, but it matters for all sorts of policies. What happens at the state level matters. Both positive things. A lot of states began adopting same-sex marriage, and then I think that influenced the Supreme Court because the sky didn't fall. Opposite sex marriage didn't end. All of those parade of horribles that we heard were going to happen if same-sex marriage was allowed didn't occur. So same-sex marriage became the law of the land. But the negative state actions are also influential, and they matter because they legitimize attacks on the community. They legitimize transphobia and violence against the community. And then what happens nationally in the United States, it matters. The United States is very influential, and I know there's criticisms of that and pros to that, but our policies do influence what happens in other parts of the world. So we need to work both at the local level, or rather at the local level, at the state level, at the national level, and at the international level, because all of these issues are interrelated and interconnected. So with that, I'm going to encourage you all to be involved and to get out there and continue the fight for equality, especially during Pride Month. And I know we're out of time, but I am still here and available to take any questions if anyone wants to put them in the chat. Be glad to answer any of them.
Honorable Heilman, we cannot thank you enough. What a beautiful and wonderful lesson. I'm seeing that our Q&A is actually overflowing here. We have anonymous questions as well. Everyone's interested in how can we get involved. Josh has a question that says, thanks for a great presentation, Professor. It's truly a history lesson for us all. He asks a question of all the significant legislation you've been a part of, which are you most proud of? And are you able to choose one that has been most significant for the history of LGBTQ rights?
Well, I think the thing that I'm most proud of is our ordinance prohibiting discrimination on the basis of HIV and AIDS. In large part, and for those of you who are younger, you didn't experience this, but in 1983, 84, 85, there were people who would not rent to people who were perceived as having HIV or AIDS. There was discrimination in the healthcare field, discrimination in sort of all aspects of life. And to be able to pass that kind of ordinance and to influence, because it wasn't just West Hollywood and Los Angeles, once we did this, and this is the importance of things at the local level, all these other cities contacted us and they wanted to borrow our ordinance and they wanted to implement something similar. And so it had this incredible ripple effect. So I thought that was, that's something I'm really proud of for our community and my involvement.
Wonderful. And then Honorable Heilman, we know we have a hard stop at 5:50, but there's someone who's so excited. If we could just get this last question here. It says again, and I've seen quite a few of them, Honorable Heilman, and it says, thanks for an amazing presentation, all of your leadership. Final question, is there any other example of a relatively small city that's been so influential in impacting national policy?
You know, I think there are other cities. Berkeley has been pretty influential on a number of policies, but there are a number of cities, and that's what's great about being involved at the local level. You get to go to these conferences with other city leaders, and San Jose has been a leader on environmental issues, and you learn from other cities policies and programs that you can borrow and implement and tweak and make fit your community. So for those of you who aren't involved at the local level, I really encourage you to do so. It's a great way of learning more about your community, but also I've learned so much being involved on the city council, and I think it's also helped me in my teaching as well.
Wonderful. Again, we thank you so much. This presentation is being recorded as well, so we will make sure and have it available for those that are unable to attend or will want to rewatch. I know I will. What a wonderful history lesson. Please join me in thanking and again, thanking you so much, Honorable Professor John Heilman. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Burdell. And as you said earlier, I'm at Southwestern. So if anyone does have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I'd be glad to be of help in any way.
And we're excited to help you, have you join UWLA in the future for a class, teaching a class.
You never know. I might be over there.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate you. If someone has here, what does it cost financially to run for local office?
A lot more than I wanted it to.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. I know you have to go. Thank you, Honorable Heilman. You have a wonderful evening. And thank you, everyone, for joining this presentation, Pride Month 2023. UWLA celebrates you. Have a good one. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Great job, sir.
Thank you, sir. Is there, I recall, is there something I need to do now?
Now, as you click out, it'll ask you to save, and you want to save it to your computer if you can.
Okay. It says end webinar for all, so go ahead and click that.
Yep.